Okay, let's get started. Welcome everyone to Topos Colloquium. Uh, Today we're having a kind of different sort of talk, but I think it's going to be a really good one. So, Leo McElroy is from Hack Club, a kind of sister organization, nonprofit to us here at Topos, and he'll be talking about something I think is very important for us in the ACT community. I think it can really help with adoption and engagement of our ideas. So that's why I invited Leo here today, and I think it'll also be really fun. So, Leo, the floor is yours.
Great. Thanks, David. I'm really excited to share with you. As David mentioned, I'm Leo, and I'm going to talk about making digital tools that communicate ideas to people by helping them use those ideas to express themselves. So, also, as David mentioned, it's possible that my work is quite a bit different from what you're used to seeing at the Topos Institute. Um, I think David invited me to talk because we're both interested in communication and we're interested in how being precise, maybe to the point of actually being formal about what we say, helps other people understand us. For many of you, that's using category theory. For me, it's using programming. And perhaps even more importantly than helping other people understand us, it's about how it helps us understand ourselves and what we really mean. So I prescribe to the educational philosophy that people learn best when they make things that they care about, which they share with others. So to help people learn, I make tools to help people make things. And sometimes they're physical tools like this. This is a CNC machine I made with some friends in Oslo. It was an award for the most innovative company in Scandinavia in 2018. It was kind of meta because the machine actually created an award on stage, which in this case was a circuit board, and then the company that won got to keep both of them. But more often, I make digital tools like these. So these are a bunch of tools I've made over the years. Some of them are for making music, like up here. Some are for parametrically defining mechanical parts, like this one. Some are for making electronic things, like circuit boards. Some are for exploring fractals and iterated function systems. Some are for visualizing knitting patterns. Some for making games. This is a meta one for making data flow environments. And in there is an environment for making racks and pinions. And you might notice that there tends to be a pattern to these tools where there's some sort of formal representation on the left, often a text program, which is the thing that I try to help people learn. But sometimes a program of another sort, like these affine transformation squares for the fractals or this data flow stuff. And then something else on the right. And the something else is something relatable and understandable. Often you can understand the output before you can understand the input. And I would consider all of these some form of microworld. So what I'm going to talk about today is what constitutes a microworld and why it's a good way to communicate ideas. One thing I want to mention as well is that almost everything I'll show you today is actually a link to a live project. So you can go and play around with it if you'd like. And that's everything on this slide. Most of the examples I'll show you, that even includes things like this CNC machine is an open source project, and it's all available on GitHub. So if you want to really dig into them, you can, go as much as you'd like. So getting back to the talk, some guideposts for today. I am going to show you what the default educational tool was at Hack Club, which is representative of a common model of teaching. I'm going to give a bit of history on Piaget and Papert, who we'll draw inspiration from when thinking about microworlds. We're going to look at, in greater detail, some of the microworlds that I just showed you before, and then follow along with how I developed one at Hack Club. And finally, we're going to try to distill some of these qualities of microworlds themselves, which will hopefully give some tools to any of you that are interested in communicating in this way. So Hack Club is a global network of coding clubs created by teenagers. My role there is that I design and run the clubs program for this network of hundreds of autonomous clubs. They're in about 30 countries around the world. And a few years back, before I started, we ran a workshop bounty to generate content for the clubs. So this resulted in a lot of material, like hundreds of workshops, and these were almost all made by club leaders. And for hundreds of workshops for clubs that meet 1 hour a week, to run them is like years worth of content. And let's take a look at one of these to get an idea of their structure. There's a common structure to all of them. And the idea is that you'd be walked through making a small project in about an hour, and then you could hack on it at the end. We'll call it the kind of walkthrough template model. So here's a very popular one for making a website. And you can see that it shows you what you're going to do up here. And then it tells you very explicitly all the steps you need to take, even telling you, when to press certain buttons and what code you need. And this content has served a lot of clubs well. It's certainly project-oriented, which I like. But the issue with it is that a lot of the club participants end up just following along exactly and copying the exposition verbatim, and they all make the same projects at the end. So that also meant that they tended not to care about those projects as much because they didn't really feel personally attached to them. And our objective is to get people making projects which they care about. So we started wondering, is there some content we can create that will facilitate that? And I want to point out that one of the main reasons why the clubs default to this expository model of teaching is that it's kind of the predominant model available to the club leaders. So it's this perspective they learn in school that teaching is about telling people things, and kids especially are like vessels to have knowledge poured into them, which there's a place for it sometimes. But the Microworld perspective is really that teaching is more about creating the circumstances for people to discover things for themselves. And to understand where this comes from, let's take a bit of a look back in history. So John Piaget was a child psychologist. He was one of the great psychologists of the 20th century. And over the course of the century, he followed only B.F. Skinner in citations, actually, edging out Freud for that spot. And he was interested in the structure of knowledge and how knowledge developed. So he studied how knowledge developed in children and watched that process play out during human development. And in the 1950s, while pursuing a theory of how children develop understanding of numbers, he encountered the work of the Bourbaki group, which you'll see here, which is maybe a group of mathematicians that many of you are familiar with. They were on a quest to unify mathematics from a structural perspective. And Piaget found that this concept of mother structures, or these fundamental structures out of which number and mathematical thinking were created, developed by the Bourbaki, mirrored the sort of mental processes he saw in children. And he was so taken with this that he decided he should bring some mathematicians to his lab. Notably among them was a topologist named Seymour Papert. As an interesting aside, another one of these mathematicians was Benoit Mandelbrot, whose uncle was actually one of the founders of the Bourbaki. And as David pointed out to me the other day, Piaget later in his career ended up writing some category theory papers too. Anyway, so Papert, this mathematician, curiously became one of Piaget's proteges. And Piaget himself actually said that no one understood his ideas quite as well as Papert. These ideas were about how children develop mental models of the world, and then they have experiences which force them to reconcile those models and develop new ones. And so this was a theory about knowledge, how it developed, and Papert extended this into a practical learning theory called constructionism by asserting that this process was facilitated by children making shareable artifacts of personal significance. So the best way for them to develop their models and have experiences which would help them test them was this: they turned those models into things they could share with people that they cared about. And Papert went on to become a pioneering educational technologist. The special insight that he had, in my opinion, and the reason why the protege of a great child psychologist became a technologist, is that the computer was an amazing tool. It offered unparalleled potential for facilitating this sort of learning. And he writes about this in Mindstorms, which in my opinion is one of the best books written on learning or technology, almost certainly the best book written on both of them at the same time. And if you find the talk interesting, I highly recommend reading it. A lot of my ideas are clearly influenced by it. And in Mindstorms, he lays out the principles underlying the first programming language for children, which was Logo. It was really the first programming language designed to be accessible to everyone. It's quite a powerful language. And it was the predecessor to Scratch, but it's more like a variant of Lisp. And he also introduces the idea of the microworld. And the way he describes it is a growing place for a specific species of powerful idea or intellectual structure. And you may have noticed that this phrase, powerful idea, also shows up in the subtitle of Mindstorms. What's meant by this is an idea that you can use to think. So it's an idea that changes the way you think about things. And in the context of programming, it might be something like recursion or encapsulation. I'm sure there are many of them within category theory, within math in general. So these were the sorts of ideas that Seymour was especially interested in. And he lays out some criteria for crafting microworlds. So one is that you should be able to relate an idea to something that you know. So from the perspective of making something to give to someone, you should be able to relate the idea to something they know. You should give that person tools to allow them to make that idea their own, and that will afford them the chance to do activities with this idea, and preferably activities that they care about, which for kids was often things like making games or music, and that all of the concepts you need should be accessible within the microworld. So to make this a bit more concrete, let's look at this first microworld that he introduced, which was a world for learning about geometry. And instead of learning geometry through logical proofs like Euclid or algebraically like Descartes, in this world, we can learn about geometry computationally with this concept of a turtle by using it to make things. And I can actually pop this in the chat as well if you would like to play along. I can find the chat. So what is in our turtle microworld? This was originally done in Logo. I've recreated it here in JavaScript. And as a testament to the staying power of these ideas, we actually still use this with our clubs today, and the young people like it. I have to admit, I find the Logo one a little bit more elegant, but everyone wants to learn JavaScript. So I'm not opposed to meeting people where they want to go. But the ideas are still the same. So we'll start with, we've got this notion of a turtle that we can direct around. So it has some state, which is a powerful idea. And you see that it's got an orientation as well. So we can tell it to go forward. Everything's done in sort of intrinsic coordinates. And we can tell it to turn. And we'll illustrate that change in angle by having it go forward again. And you can see that we can start to take these kind of basic ideas about navigating this geometric space with our turtle and use them to make things. So let's make a pattern with this. So with just those, I can start to make something like this, which you can see how this might be an appealing way to explore geometry for someone just getting into it, because they can understand what's going on. And you can find some interesting angles which start to tell you some meaningful properties of what's going on here. And if we sprinkle in just a little bit more concepts into our kind of construction kit in our microworld, so we have this ability to go forward, the notion of the turtle, its heading, and the fact that it's leaving a trail. Let's add the ability to change its size and set its color, and we start to get a whole new class of projects which are quite interesting. So just a few ideas have given us a pretty interesting landscape to explore, and I recommend playing around with it yourself. To get a better sense of this process of casting some powerful ideas into a microworld, let's take the one that we just looked at, this turtle world, and think about turning it into a world for investigating laws of motion. So here are Newton's laws. We're just going to do 2 or 3. The third one about action and reaction is really more about interacting particles. For the illustration purposes, we'll stick with one turtle for now. And let's think about how we can take these and cast them into turtle world. So the first law of inertia, that a body at rest remains at rest, a body in motion remains in motion unless acted upon by a force, can be translated to something in turtle world like our turtle will keep its state unless it's compelled by some command to change. That's similar to what we had before, but we're adding this notion of something moving as well. So the second law of F equals ma, that when acted upon by a force, the time rate change of its momentum will equal that force, that the motion of the turtle can change basically only by pushing it, can be translated into something like the turtle's speed can be modified only by commands to change speed. So you can't set speed, you can't set position, you can just change its speed. And adapting the rules of our microworld a little bit, we end up with a new world for exploring a different set of ideas that I can show you here. So now I'm just setting the speed, not telling it to go forward. I'll pop a link to this in the chat as well. And let's see. So what can we do with this turtle? Well, we've added another concept to our microworld as well, this notion of creating a timer, because we need to do things on some interval if we actually want to adjust, if we want to get interesting behavior from our turtle. So let's see if we can make a shape here, and I'll do this on 1 second. So we can draw a square by issuing these commands to change its angle every second. And let's see if we take this. And we're starting to see how just subtle changes to the rules of our microworld are accommodating similar projects, but that have a slightly different character to them. And let's look at a more complete example that might be intriguing. So here's the same sets of commands with the same additional concepts of changing the size and the speed, and this time using a bit of oscillation. And we get what I think is a quite beautiful drawing playing around with this. So we are getting a sense of how these tiny microworlds can take a set of ideas and be cast into a relatable form, which makes our activity matter, which kind of gives a foothold to someone who's interested in exploring geometry or motion. Let's now get into some of the microworlds that I've built over the years. And I'm interested in helping people learn to code while appreciating powerful ideas associated with coding. So I need to figure out ways to use code to make things people want and can understand. And what people want is always going to be contextual to that group of people that you're targeting. So it's one of the reasons why we need a variety of microworlds. And so, sorry, there's like a red slash coming up on my screen. I don't know if that's visible. I think it's a Zoom thing.
Oh, it's a Zoom thing. Maybe you can go on and we can see if we can diagnose it.
Okay. Anyway, no, it's no problem. So moving on to some of my microworlds. So one of the groups that I have spent a lot of time with over the years is people in maker spaces. And I noticed that there are some powerful ideas around parametric design that were evading a lot of people who were doing a lot of design work, laser cutting. So I created this microworld environment with a custom language for creating 2D parametric designs. And we can take a look at this. So the way that many people will make things when they are doing designs for laser cutters, they use like a drawing program and just direct modeling, which is basically just.
Sorry to interrupt. I don't know where those, I agree those flashes came from Zoom. I think I saw them happen. Maybe you could unshare and reshare.
Sure, yeah.
I don't know if that'll help.
Okay. and then reshare.
Never seen anything like that.
Yeah, I saw
That's
someone's
a lot
name.
better. Okay.
I could see the name of the vandal when they left the mark.
Okay.
Anyway, so the way that most people were making designs is they were basically just doing something analogous to drawing it on a piece of paper, but using a computer. And I wanted to help expose people to some ideas around making things, to parameterizing patterns, and to describing things based on the relationships of the parts of the object they were making, so that you could make boxes that might have variable numbers of tabs or something of that sort. So let me give you a little introduction to this language. And I already popped the link in there. So here, I'll go back to the site so it looks the same if you're following along. So I am using a concept like a turtle again that I can tell to go forward. And let me turn that on so we can see. So I can tell this to go forward. I can tell this to turn. That's the same as before. Go forward. And then where this starts to deviate from the logo conception of the world and the microworld that we just looked at, or the logo conception of the turtle and the microworld we just looked at, is that my commands are actually modifying the entire piece of geometry that I made, which if I'm trying to define relationships of one piece of geometry to another piece of geometry, this is going to be important. But it means that I can do things like translate my object after the fact. So for making patterns that are supposed to be fabricable, this is going to be essential to our toolkit. Let me see if I can make a little interesting pattern in here that could actually be fabricated. So I'll start with something similar to what we did before, this spiral. And I will, let's see, what if I were to copy that some number of times, do it 3 times, and let's rotate it. And we'll do it radially symmetrically. So because I have my initial one, I'll need that. And if we move that up, it starts to get a little more interesting. Let's turn that. Okay. And I mentioned that this was for making fabricable stuff. So this is kind of an interesting pattern. But if I was to try to actually cut this out, it would just be a mess. It's not really something that represents a real object very well. So there are tools in this microworld for turning things into stuff with body, with mass, that have area. And so if I thicken this and then take the outline, I get an object which could actually be produced. And let me just increase the spacing a little bit here. And maybe it was all right. And to illustrate that a little bit better, why don't I, there we go. So why don't I fill in the color here? There you go. So you can see how here's a world for exploring things that we actually make. Specifically, it was on a laser cutter, but it could be any machine that does 2D fabrication, like the CNC that I started with. And let's look at some of the things that people actually made in Gram. So closing that up. So these were all made by people who had no experience programming or doing digital fabrication at all. In most cases, it was actually their first time ever doing it. That's the project that you see coming out of it. On the left, we have this bookmark with this geometric pattern. On the right, we have this business card stand, a collection of lamps. These were made by some young people in a one-day workshop, and you see they did custom patterns, so they would cast custom shadows. The center one was quite an interesting one too. This is from a program, so these are all from the same project, and you can see the project is this hat that I'm wearing here, and you can see the pieces of it fabricated here with the design in Gram. And this is from a program I ran in Boston in 2021. It was to teach fabric craftsmen how to use small scale automation. And part of that was programming the machines and creating designs for them. And originally it was for producing masks like this one exactly, actually. And as the mask market sort of subsided, we shifted to finding custom applications for the people in the program. And I had a lot of milliners who were interested in this, who didn't really identify with technology so much, certainly not programming, but they wanted to make hats. So they learned programming to make hats. And they often didn't even think about the fact it was programming until after the fact. So here's a workshop of them teaching other people how to do this after they've been doing it themselves. Let's look at another microworld for making physical things. This is an environment. You can tell I have a certain style with my signature yellow here. I call it construction paper yellow. Here's another environment. This is one for making circuit boards. And I developed this with a friend for a global network of makerspaces that do a lot of surface mount design of circuit boards. But they don't necessarily, people doing this don't necessarily do a lot of programming. Some of them do, but many of them don't. So once again, we wanted to introduce people to these powerful ideas in programming. And so we found a project they were interested in, which was making boards like all these boards here. And we created a microworld where they could do these projects that they could understand that they wanted to do using these new powerful concepts in the world. So let's look at a simple example here. The way that this works is the components. This one doesn't use a custom language like Graham. It uses JavaScript, but it has a tiny library which sort of defines our construction kit for the world. And we've got some descriptions of components up top. Then you can define your board and start adding things to it that you can place and name. And you can drag around these like you can in Graham to get a little more direct feedback from the environment and create your wires. So there's still a distinct set of concepts used for creating these things. The notion of the component, the notion of the wire, and then the notion of drawing with layers. And one of the things that we added to this environment was a bunch of tools for sort of bidirectional manipulation of the program. So you have this formal representation on the left, which for the purposes of developing a better understanding of what you're doing is very important. But you can also adjust it on the right by changing the output. So you can work with this thing that you understand and kind of be more direct about what you're trying to say here and see how that changes what's happening on the left-hand side while keeping this still idiomatic and understandable. And this goes both ways too, where if I add a component up here, it comes up in my direct manipulation portion, and then I can drag it back, and that comes back and propagates over here. So let's look at a project that someone made with SVG PCB. This is an actual circuit board that was then fabricated and stuffed. And of course, if you click on it, you can look at the design itself, a live version of it. Moving on to some of my work at Hack Club recently. Here's a microworld with another custom language, which was, this was an experiment in trying to minimize how little exposition we could give in workshops. And so this language has maybe around 8 concepts in it that are all you need to learn. You can learn them in a couple minutes. I'll show you. And then you can start making projects that you can understand because the projects are songs. So, and you can actually start composing your projects before you know anything about the microworld, because all you have to do is hum and then figure out how to translate that. So as I mentioned, everyone wants to learn JavaScript these days. So we secretly embedded this language inside of JavaScript. But I think it actually adds a little bit of noise. So we'll just get rid of all of this to just focus on this section here. And let's see what's in the construction kit for Muse to start making projects. We have notes. Is that audible? Cool. We have notes, and you can see it's showing me, what's happening over here. Once again, giving me some direct feedback, making it relatable in addition to the sound. We can do different notes. So those played at once. If we want to arpeggiate, we can add a pause in between. We can shorten things with a minus. We can lengthen things with a plus. And we can group things to apply these modifiers. That's a powerful idea across a bunch of them. Or we can repeat as a modifier. And so we basically just told people, here's the construction kit, see what you can make with it. And I am going to show you a song from someone, once again, who's first time programming. This is actually somebody who didn't really identify with technology very much. Fair to say a technology critic, but they loved music. And so this is one of the first programs they ever wrote. Let's see here. Which I think is a fantastic first program. Much more interesting than printing hello world. Muse also has the ability to use samples, so you can record your own if you want to express yourself that way. Let me see if I could find a good simple beats. Here's a little tune using some samples. And I'll clear this. And something else you can do in Muse, which is another one of these forms of making it easier for people to express themselves directly, is that you can bind sounds to keys. So you can use any sounds you want, or songs you've composed. In this case, I just took a bunch of these samples and have bound them to my keyboard. So I've turned my computer into a little instrument, and I can compose this way by doing something directly, seeing what that actually was, and then layering it back into what I made. And I think my pauses were a little bit different. Let's see how that sounds. So there's some accommodations in this world for making a little bit easier to express yourself directly, and then take that formal representation, layer it back in, reflect on it, which is a common pattern we'll see in these microworlds. So we've seen a couple different microworlds that make ideas relatable and which people have used to make things. These are a bunch of other tunes in Muse that you can listen to when you get the slides. I just showed you a few of them. But oftentimes people need a little additional support to actually get started. So they need things like documentation, examples, like motivation and inspiration. And that's to follow like how to develop some of these materials too. We're going to trace the path of developing Hack Club's most popular microworld at the moment, which is a microworld for creating games with some, I'm seeing some little vandals pop up here. Small enough to ignore, I think. So we're going to track like making some kind of components of microworlds, but not full ones, which will then blossom into a full one. So following along with this idea of how little exposition we could give people, we ran an experiment where we basically made a whole workshop, which was just this GIF, where we just say, try to make this. It didn't tell them anything. And we gave a little bit of recommendations about how to like search for stuff on Google, but just wanted to see what people could do with just a little push. And interestingly, people actually did pretty well. These are all, once again, live projects. You can check the code that they wrote. These are made by young people, mostly aged like 10 to 12, who were programming for the first time. So this is like 45 minutes of experience, with the only instruction being try to make that thing that I just showed you. And you can use Google. And you can see that a lot of them start to follow the stress ball, where like all of these have circles in them. And then they just find something else to do, or they get caught on a different idea that was interesting. I particularly like this one where I don't think there was really, I guess there was an oscillation of sort with the stress ball kind of bouncing back and forth. But I don't think this person had encountered the concept of the sine wave yet. And I think they'll have a good place to situate it when they do in school. So this was promising to me, that just a little prompt could get people doing their own projects. And we decided, but a lot of people were still getting lost kind of in the woods of the internet searching for things. So we decided that, let's minimize that. We'll do this again. We'll give people a prompt, and we will also give them a explicit construction kit. So this is kind of something analogous to like having the language defined or that library defined. But in this case, it's literally just a set of examples that you can compose together. So the examples are presented sort of as like, as a meaningful output. Like the example is this thing on the right, and the stuff to do that is the thing on the left. What people care about here is this kind of semantic value of it. And the way that people would use these is they'd take them and they'd kind of just glue them together. And they would make projects like this. And you can see how these are taking inspiration from that initial GIF that I showed you. But they would also make projects like this. And these are very different from the initial thing I showed you. But you can see how it's starting to betray something that they want to do. That would be a promising, fertile ground to make a microworld. These are all like, this is like some kind of physics engine of sorts. This ellipse is being distorted by keyboard inputs. Here's some collisions. And what really gives this away, what's going on here, to me, is this attempt at some version of Pong, which at the moment is just kind of, it's an interpretation of it. It's not quite a game. But we decided to lean into it and created this other set of examples. So this time we had a little library, but a new construction kit for making games. And we gave this to people, and they started making games like these. And these are starting to look like pretty sophisticated programs, actually. This is a game that has levels. And I mean that when there's levels like geometrically, but there's also levels, and that when you complete the task, you get another version of the level that's more challenging, that you can lose, that has an objective. And this is Pong, actually, and these are the same students making these, young people. So now maybe they have 7 hours of experience, and still minimal instruction. And here is Pong made by the same person that made Pong before, just a couple weeks later, using this new construction kit. And this is a playable game. It's got a score. You can win. 2 people can play it at once. And so we decided to take these ideas and really integrate them into a full microworld, which resulted in GameLab. So GameLab takes that same library as before, and I can send a link to this. And it augments this environment. So it's the same sorts of projects. But one of the issues before was that all of the characters, you may have noticed, were all just colored rectangles, which can be a fun constraint, but people wanted to add a bit more character to their characters. So we added this environment where you can draw your own characters. And let me add this guy to this world. and use those to create things. And I'll pull up this minimal example again, actually, that we started with, so I don't have to fill in everything. And you can see that there's still just a few concepts in our construction kit, which are included here. One of the lessons is that we wanted to document what was in this construction kit very explicitly. So we integrated that in, and this tells you, all the concepts that you need, which is still less than 20. We have these, this means of giving direct feedback with the output being right there, and if being more direct about what we're trying to do with things like this dragger, this number sliding tool, or the ability to actually draw our sprites. One of my favorite parts of the whole editor is that you can also draw your tunes in this sequencer, which I don't know if I want to spend too much time, which is quite fun to play around with. And interestingly, I'm very amazed with the sorts of delightful noises that people can make with this. Also horrible ones. So let's look at some of the projects actually that people made in GameLab. We have this knockoff game of Flappy Birds, Crappy Birds, which has a nice soundtrack and some collision sound effects. We've got a version of Snake, which is about less than 100 lines of code, and it has a generated background that's randomly generated every time using a tiling technique. We have a bunch of interpretations of this Chrome Dino game here, which you can play if you'd like. Once again, we have a custom soundtrack there with some triggered effects. And we also, one of the things also was, one of the lessons was about the importance of prompts. So if we go back one slide. So we integrated in our construction kit, our tools for more direct manipulation, our formal documentation of what is in the construction kit, but we also needed to give people a little push to get going. So we created these challenges that are embedded in here. And the sneaky thing about these is they're half a question and half just a documentation where all of the answers are actually in the challenges themselves. So it's a way of getting people to read them. But many people would start off, it's easy to start off using this when you can just give somebody a push and say, here, try to do these. And they would start doing them. And interestingly, when we would bring it to clubs, here there's 12 of these, there used to be around 16 or so. But a lot of people would only get to challenge 6 or 7, and then they would start doing something else. And at first you might think, oh, well, that's not good, they're getting stuck. But actually it tended to be more the opposite, that they would just get going, making their own games. So that was quite heartening to us, that these collection of things were starting to give people the right tools they needed to start teaching themselves things and expressing their own projects. So let's take some stock of what is in our microworld again. We have our construction kit. This can be something like a language, like in Muse or Gram, or it can be a library, like it is in GameLab or in the SVG PCB. What's important is that it's small, it's mind-sized bytes, so you can hold it all in your head at once. It's composable, which I know I should be very careful using that word around category theorists, but what I mean is that we can take these building blocks and stick them together to create new building blocks, in this case. And it has to be sufficiently specific to define a species of idea or project, but sufficiently abstract to allow people to actually express themselves with it. So it should support doing a variety of different projects that have a kindedness to them. We also have our environment. So the environment is what's going to help us make our ideas explorable. It's what's going to help us make the ideas relatable to people so they can understand them. And it's going to be what helps us make the activities with this construction kit matter. So with the milliners, our environment helps them make hats. With the Fab Lab attendees, it's circuit boards. Young people might prefer games. And one of the keys here is that the user's creative ends come first. So they don't want to talk about programming. They want to talk about shapes. They want to talk about songs. They want to talk about games. And in most cases, that's actually all they can talk about. So it's very important that your environment, casts things in that form, even if the ideas might not, initially seem to lend themselves to it. You want to help people understand what they said, which is one of the reasons why I value code so much, is that it's an explicit way of doing that. And then you can also augment the tool by helping people be more explicit about what they mean. And that's why I also include these tools for direct manipulation that might back propagate into the formal representation itself. We also have examples which are going to show useful patterns, like how to turn, changing a velocity into a jump, or give us starting points, like this Dino game that was remixed by a number of our club members, or that just inspire us by showing the scope of the system, like this original game with, custom generated art in the background and multi-body physics simulation of some sort. We also want to give prompts and challenges, and these are often just to get people started. So they don't have to get, where you tell them to go. They just need to get going. It's like out the door where they'll make discoveries. And something that I didn't emphasize as much on the tour, but which is also very important, is this idea of sharing projects. So you should make it easy for people to connect with the community around the projects that they do. Remember, the educational philosophy I prescribe to is people learn best by making projects they care about, which they share with others. And you may have caught that this is actually a little bit different than the way I described that Seymour defined constructionism as this quality of making shareable artifacts of personal significance, which doesn't actually mean that you have to share them. It's just that they can be shared. I would say if you make something shareable, you should share it. Sharing your artifacts, it creates this opportunity to develop a community and to participate in a culture of ideas, which for anyone that works with ideas knows that that's critically important. Knowing that other people are going to experience the thing you share motivates you to craft things more beautifully. And it also generates a collection of artifacts to produce more examples for everyone else. Also, at Hack Club, it's one of the only ways I can tell what's going on in the clubs. So that's one of the reasons I selfishly promote it so much. And here's one example of the way we promote that at Hack Club. It's like a social media site for sharing learning. So reviewing all these things together, our microworlds have powerful ideas in them. They have construction kits, which capture those ideas in small sets of like composable systems. They give us environments that help us relate to the ideas and reflect on how we're expressing them. They show us how to use those construction kits by giving us useful patterns in them and places to start, inspiration. They give us prompts to help us get going, and they come with a community to provide feedback. So these are what are in Microworlds, and I showed the status quo with all of our workshops produced by, sourced from the community. I would like to do this again with Microworlds. So of course, I created a tool to convey the principle of Microworlds as a Meta Microworld, where you can make your own microworld, and and then it gives you some structure for it. And let's look at, I actually already showed you 2 microworlds that exist in this tool, with the turtle and I call them newts here, but the Newton's turtles. I could have probably called them slugs as well. But now let's look at this microworld again with some of the additional attributes that we emphasized while developing the microworld for Hack Club. So we have our small set of ideas with the turtle that are powerful, and we've made them relatable by being able to see them. But we've also embedded in a full coverage of what's in this construction kit here. And we start to show meaningful examples of taking these ideas and turning them into outputs that would be significant for somebody using them to make something. We've also included a sharing button which links directly to Scrapbook that I showed you before, so that's very easy for people using this. And to better articulate this too, well, one way of conveying this is that you can see that this is another microworld for exploring shaders, and it has similar structure. But to also get a sense of it, you can look at the source for these. So you can see that here's this turtle microworld that gets plugged into the environment I just showed you. And it's got, a place where the construction kit is defined, where the output is made relatable. It's got the documentation with the full coverage of the construction kit and examples. It has this default example to inspire people initially, but not so complex that it's not understandable. And my hope is that, and people can create new microworlds just by dropping new folders here. And my hope is that I can populate this meta world of mini microworlds with lots of beautiful ideas that learners can harness to express themselves. I know there are quite a few more powerful ideas than just turtles and pixel dough. It doesn't encompass the scope of all of them. And I know that there are people listening right now that have powerful ideas in their head. So I would love to hear from you if you think you want to communicate any of them through microworlds. As I mentioned before, everything is open source. If you have any thoughts or questions, I'm happy to answer them now or later if you want to reach out. And thank you very much for your time. It's a pleasure to share with you.
Thanks, Leo. Lots of claps in the chat. That was great. So questions from the audience? Looks like Tim has a question.
I raised my hand to be polite. Yeah, so first of all, thanks for the great talk. It was really exciting. And it actually felt a lot like we had a talk by Kevin Buzzard, I think, I don't know whether it was this year or last, but like on the lean theorem prover. And it felt like that, like watching someone who's like super familiar with an environment going like tickety tack, 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 and then magic things happen really quickly. And like it had the same excitement as that. And like a similar kind of idea. So I don't know, something I found super interesting in your talk that you mentioned was this idea of like bidirectionality. So like that, we're very used to the idea of like you take some formal thing and you compile it to some user-friendly thing. And often, I don't know, in my limited experience, doing this is much easier than trying to go in the other direction, like turning, user input on some informal system into a formal structure. This is really hard. So I was wondering, like, when you're designing these systems, is it like a back and forth? Like you come up with a formal idea, but then you think, I don't know, maybe the informal idea, there's not a good way to back propagate information. So I need to go back and change I don't know yet. What kind of experiences did you have with this bidirectionality stuff? Because I think this is super important in making these tools useful and easy.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I mean, often they have to be designed in conjunction with each other. So it's like the kind of parameterization of the construction kit. You need to know what sort of outputs that might make that will provide like meaningful handles that can map directly to things. There are ways of finding manipulation handles that might not be directly represented in the code itself, like techniques with differential programming or something, basically where you turn it into like an optimization system. And actually originally when I started writing CAD tools, those were the sorts of tools I were making, which are more like the sorts of traditional CAD tools people use that simulate drafting systems. And I think my approach to it, this is a topic I'm still exploring a lot, but I've tended to gravitate towards like designing languages or libraries in conjunction with the output of the system, so that you can kind of know from the start where there will be meaningful connections that will like pop up to the user. But it's a great question. Yeah, something I'd like to study more myself.
It's a cool problem. Okay, thanks again for the talk.
Okay, looks like we have Seth.
Oh, hello. Is my microphone okay?
Yep.
It's a little quiet, but I think
okay.
I can hear you.
I'll make it okay. My question is, I hope that this doesn't sound too skeptical, but my general question is, how has constructivism fared in the development of education to this day. I personally am extremely impressed by your work, and I'm looking forward to playing with it and referring it to friends, as well as connecting it with the more abstract mathematics of our community. But I'm wondering what research has been done and effects that how has Pappert's vision of constructivism revolutionizing all of education, how has that played out over the decades?
Yeah. I mean, education is a wicked problem. Like, certainly his ideas have been very influential. I think in some ways that people are not always aware of. Like Alan, there's an interesting connection with Alan Kay, who was very influenced by his work that brought it to Silicon Valley, which is now propagated to like in some sense of like constructionist ideas being integrated into lots of these ubiquitous computers that we have now. But I think that oftentimes, while forgetting the kind of philosophical principles underlying them, so it's like we have the technology, but like we like don't have the right culture, and for that reason, like a lot of constructionism doesn't really live up to its potential. I think a really interesting demonstration of this is actually there's a story that when Alan Kay visited the learning lab, Seymour's lab at MIT, on the way home, he sketched out the Dynabook, and that turned into this series of papers on like an early description of the personal computer in a form that we would now recognize. And these papers are really interesting because most of it actually is about just like Piaget and educational philosophy, which is very strange for a technical paper now. And the other half is just like, or it's not even half, it's like 1/8 of it is the technical specs, which is what you would read a technical paper, you'd expect that to be the whole thing. And we just blew away the technical specs. He's basically like, yeah, it's all doable. We can make computers like this. But like all of the like cultural, philosophical stuff, we just kind of forgot. So the vision was that these computers would be amazing tools for making things. And predominantly, they're really tools for consuming stuff now, with like literally like feeds or like the major format that people use. So there's that aspect of it with like the culture around the technology. Of course, computers are still amazing tools for making things, but it's not most people's experience of it. Regarding the education more specifically, like Scratch, which is the most popular intro programming tool, it's one of the most popular languages actually, this block-based language, is has a very tight lineage with Seymour's ideas. Mitch Resnick was a student of Seymour's and essentially like kind of took over his successor lab at MIT. So these constructionist ideas are still imbued in educational technology that many people use. I would say I think Scratch is a fantastic tool and like it's helped a lot of people. But I think in some ways I have a similar feeling that like the ideas have been realized in some of the things that we interact with, sometimes all the time, but they're not like the ideas themselves are not prevalent enough, or people don't have enough awareness of them. So it's like we have the tools, but we don't always have the right, culture or mentality around using them. And there's still a lot of work to be done there. Actually, Cynthia Solomon, who's one of the inventors of Logo, is giving a talk next week on 50 years later, constructionism, like what we learned and what we forgot, which I think will be geared at exactly this sort of question that you're asking right now.
Oh no, the two big developments, that have come to my attention over the decades are first the maker movement, and second, increasing programs for mentoring serious science research at the high school level. But I'm wondering, for example, you know, if to participants in maker activities at their high school age, do they tend to say do better in engineering and science, you know, when they enter their, you know, the career phase of their lives, you know, compared with kids who you know, just study a lot of who study and achieve academically at stellar levels in high school. Say you know, a valedictorian of a high school versus an open source leading maker. How would they, where do they, how would they compare 10 years later?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. If anyone knows of research like that, I'd love to read it.
I'm going to move on to one. If you have a quick question, Valeria, maybe you can ask it, or otherwise maybe we can stop the live stream.
Quick question is about the social side of the hack club.
Yeah.
I wanted to know, you know, you're saying 30 countries, and I wanted to know kind of how do you see that? How is the global south represented? How does it happen in other parts of the world? Is it all in English, or do we talk in native languages or different language? How does it go?
Yeah.
So the question's quick. The answer might take a while.
It's not a simple question. The short answer is that we're still figuring it out. Most of the activities are in English. We have an online community where, you know, everyone connects with each other, and almost all the activity there is in English. There's some localization that tends to be like drawn from the network itself. So, for example, we had a very engaged hack clubber in Brazil who ended up with his friends translating a bunch of stuff to Portuguese and kind of started like his own like super node in the area to coordinate clubs there. We also have a team in India where a similar phenomenon happened a couple years ago, and now it's actually just another portion of the hack club organization. So that's the short answer to the question, is that we're still figuring out. It's definitely tricky to, you know, coordinate things across all these different places and cultures, but we tend to focus on doing things in English, and then when people are excited about doing stuff, you know, that might fit their local culture better, then we try to support them, but we let them guide it because they know better than us.
Great. I want to thank you again, Leah. I hope that people in our community start to make microworlds. I think they're a really nice way to express and increase engagement and all that sort of stuff. So thanks again, and